Thank you, Alain. Thank you for welcoming us to this Science Symposium. So a bit of overview on the legislative package, which is called the Fit-for-55. I think several of the previous speakers have already mentioned the Green Deal, the Fit-for-55 package, but we want to have not a deep dive, just an overview of some of the results we got over the past 2 years. So it should work like this, yeah. So back in time, I think December 19, the European Commission adopted its Green Deal. If you remember at the time, there were the announcement of 50 policies and measures to be adopted over the period of the Commission. And a dozen of that were packed together in the so-called Fit-for-55 package that was already adopted by the European Commission a bit less than 2 years after. On the 14th of July 2021, that's the day they adopted their series of 13 or 14 proposals. And immediately, stakeholders were focusing on those pieces of legislations. There were a period of 5 months until November to react to those proposals. And you may see on our website our responses to those proposals. We had already to pick and choose some of them, and that's also the reason why, together with Jean-Marie, we will not embarrass you too much with comments on the 13 of those policies. We will also select some of them that have already, by the way, mentioned by several speakers. What were our expectations? We are regularly not commenting on the ambition of the target. So in the 2030, you will see this on the next slide. The Commission talked about minus 55%, at least minus 55% in 2030 compared to 1990 levels. But our association does not comment on the level of ambition of the target. What we're interested in is how we get there. And what we were looking at is whether this package will set the right enablers to help us investing in renewable and low carbon fuels. And because this is a long way to go to 2050 and the net zero target, we want to ensure that this blended transition will also ensure that our assets will be protected against the risk of carbon leakage. So those were our two policy asks, and our inputs are documented on our website. We have selected a few, like I said in the intro. We will share this together with Jean-Marie. I will start, and then he will go on. In the 2030 communication, the Commission were going into a bit more in detail, and they say we have selected a 1.5 scenario for the obvious reasons that this is one that is compatible with the Paris Agreement, but they were selecting a mixed scenario. That's the reason why you have an aggregation of policies and measures that are either setting a carbon pricing mechanism, ETS is one of the obvious ones, then you have mandates or targets, and Jean-Marie will comment on some of them, and you have also standards. It's really a mixture, that's the reason why it's called a mixed scenario. Let's go into ETS1. ETS1 is the oldest of the two ETSs. It covers the stationary sources for the power sector and the manufacturing sectors. And it has included 10 years ago also aviation, and now it will include also maritime. And this is a so-called downstream ETS. That means those that emit those direct emissions are reliable for the surrender of allowances. What you see on the screen is just one shot. You have backup slides that go much more into detail. That's what have been adopted by the legislators in the night of the 16th of December last year. We do not know always whether they realize what they have adopted. I will come back on that. You see the trend, so minus 62%. First comment, this is from the ETS that the major contribution to the achievement of the minus 55 is expected. The Commission's proposed minus 61, the regulators agreed on minus 62. Like I said, maritime emissions are added to this cap and trade system. There are newly included conditionalities for the level of protection against the risk of carbon leakage. Not all operators will receive their free allowances up to the benchmark if they do not meet provisions. One of them is to have met all the energy efficiency requirements from their energy audit, and another one for the 20% worst performers is to meet their carbon neutrality plan. So two conditions that can have huge impact also on the level of protection against the risk of carbon leakage. Up to 20% of their allowances can be removed. And last but not least, but I will also come back with another slide, the phase out of the free allowances was also announced by previous speakers for those sectors that see some or all of their products covered by the CBAM regulation. You will see also this on the next slide. Someone also mentioned the ETS2, which is the so-called upstream system. That means that contrary to the scheme before, those are the fuel suppliers that are the obligated parties, despite the fact the CO2 is emitted at the stack in heating device or at the tank pipe for road transport. Here you see another chart. I have to apologize, this is not the chart at the outlet. This is the chart at the inlet of the negotiations, and nobody can design the new chart because it will be based on figures that the Commission will collect from the Member States next year and the year after. The scheme will start only in 2027, but we know already the trajectory. It will be, like it was said, coming down to zero by 2044. On the slide before, you saw already that ETS is going down to zero by 2039. Third item is the so-called price adjustment mechanism, which is very often confused with a price cap of 45 euro per ton. But in the text, it is talking about a price adjustment mechanism, which means additional amount of allowances will be put in on the market to try to maintain the price around 45 euro per ton, which as a result of the inflation is already 54 at the time we speak. So there is no cap on the price. There is an adjustment mechanism. We take allowances from the cap. It's a set-aside amount below the cap, but to meet the integrity of the cap, there is absolutely no certainty that the price cap will be maintained at 54. And then, last minute was negotiated these exemptions. So some member states that have a carbon pricing system may exempt their regulated entities from participating into the ETS2, which would mean also a fragmented ETS2 that would not be compared with the ETS1, where all 11,000 ETS installations are in. And my last one is about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So you see now in reality what it means in terms of phasing out of free allowances for the phasing in products into the CBAM. It starts in 2026. There will be a transitory period, which is starting soon, to test the system and collect the data to make it work. 5 sectors were proposed by the European Commission, indeed 5 families of products, because contrary to ETS1 that they leave, coming to a CBAM, you move from a stack emissions, scope 1 and 2, you go to the carbon embedded in the product you sell on the market, which makes the life of those that have to transition a bit complicated to allocate the footprint they had at their stack to the product they deliver to the market. Cement, steel, aluminium, fertilizers and electricity were proposed by the European Commission, and the last added to the list was last minute hydrogen. There will be in 2025 a review process to see what are the eligibility criteria to bring more products on board of the CBAM. And regarding what was also mentioned by someone before me, this is an import mechanism. There is no adjustment mechanism to cover the export, which is raising a deep concern for those sectors producing in the EU that have a significant share of their production that go outside to non-EU regions. This is the case for steel, already in, but this is also the case for a sector like manufacturing of fuels. Time has come for me to pass the floor to my colleague Jean-Marie.
Sit next to me.
Good morning, everyone. Just I have the challenge to do grace to some masterpieces of the policymaker that were recently adopted by the Council. Actually, I'll start with probably the easiest one, which is FuelEU Maritime. Okay. So what is FuelEU Maritime? It's a well-to-wake low carbon fuel standard that is targeting greenhouse gas emissions reduction with the use of renewables and low carbon fuels. That's the first deliverable of this piece of regulation. The second one being the use of onshore power supply by ships when they are at berth. It defines a trajectory and mostly focuses on the how and when to reduce those emissions. So you can see that this starts with a -2% reduction in 2025 and escalates to -6% in 2030 and goes to -80% in 2050, going into different steps with some clear level of acceleration. The obligated party from this scheme are the ship owners, and they have the ability to pool their obligation across their fleet, which is of importance here. The eligible fuels are low carbon and renewable biofuels described in the red, although non-crop, of course, biofuels, and RFNBOs and recycled fuels, mainly. There is a RFNBO sunrise clause into the FuelEU Maritime that calls for a rather slow start of RFNBO use into maritime, with actually the possibility for equivalence with other alternatives, like, for instance, advanced biofuels, with feedstock listed in Annex 9A of the RED, that could achieve a minimum of 70% greenhouse gas reduction. And it definitely clarifies some penalties, which are in the magnitude of 2,000 euros per ton of ELSFO, that falls short of the obligation. But overall, there is, I would say, a rather, and some of my members of FuelsEurope may challenge me on that, but the definition of FuelEU Maritime as a regulation is rather clear and relatively flexible. I'll switch to aviation, to FuelEU Aviation. Slightly different story here. We are talking about a regulation that targets the quantity of sustainable aviation fuel that needs to be uplifted at the largest European airports. That makes of 90% of the volumes of actually based on 90% of the volumes of jet that is being sold. It again focuses on how and when to deliver those obligations, with a trajectory that is represented here, and which is for sustainable aviation fuel at large, relatively similar to what you've seen for FuelEU Maritime, with a clear acceleration between 2030 and 2035. But you also see an acceleration for the use of e-fuels, actually, and this is the blue part, I believe, inside the hull of the airplanes here, besides the green part. The obligated parties are slightly different than for FuelEU Maritime here. They are the airlines and the fuel supplier, actually. The definition of sustainable aviation fuel has evolved lately in the trilogue discussions. Of course, we are talking about RED certified biofuels, RFNBOs and recycled carbon fuels, but also new categories of synthetic low carbon fuels and synthetic low carbon hydrogen for aviation that are not necessarily renewable, that have their own specificities and are defined more towards the nature of the electricity, the actually low carbon electricity. So we are mainly talking about nuclear electricity that can be used to do ESAF. There are some constraints around the eligibility of the feedstocks in FuelEU Aviation. In terms of biofuels, no food and feed crop are eligible. The intermediate products, intermediate crops, are not in scope either as a start. Palm oil and soy derivatives are also excluded. But anything that is listed in the Annex 9 is eligible. So if there is an evolution for intermediate crops to be listed, that in the forthcoming revision of the Annex 9, this could be the case. There is something that is very important for us, which is the possibility, which is called the flexibility mechanism, which is a possibility to book and claim our obligations and to achieve that obligation on a weighted average basis across the Union airport. This mechanism, however, is associated with some level of uncertainty, as there is a report that is expected in July next year from from the Commission that could define the boundaries and eventually legiferate on this mechanism itself. So it's an important uncertainty. We are very much looking into those details with FuelsEurope. The penalties here are extremely important. Actually, there are twice the price difference between sustainable aviation fuel and fossil jet. With an additional constraint on two supplier that must meet actually their obligation in a set year and would otherwise have to carry over the remaining entitlement on the following years. So there's a double pain in the way the mandate is set up. I should go now to RED 3, which is of course the backbone of a number of things. It's extremely complex and parametric, and sorry for this representation, but the purpose of the RED, of course, is to increase the share of renewables in the European economy and in member states, growing it from 32% overall to 42.5 to 45%. In the case of RED 3, the obligated parties are the member states. It's an important nuance. They have the obligation to transpose, especially if we focus on transport, to transport mandates that are to be imposed on fuel suppliers. In the case of those transport obligations, there is an important alternative that is being offered on member states to articulate their mandates between an energy overall target of 29% use of renewable energy in transport, or alternatively using renewable fuels that enable a reduction of 14.5% of greenhouse gas in transport. This articulation is left at the discretion of member states in the transposition process that is to take 18 months. That's likely to take us to the spring of 2025. And on top of that, in a more granular way, you also have to meet some energy targets that are expressed in energy content for a new combined obligation for advanced biofuels, as we say, Annex 9A listed feedstock-based biofuels, and RFNBOs with a sub mandate of 1% for RFNBOs. That energy content being double counted, associated with multipliers. So if you look at the nominal energies half of that, and if you consider that now all transport modes are in scope, but maritime and aviation are incentivized with a 1.2 multipliers for Annex 9A and a 1.5 multipliers for RFNBO, you may end up with much smaller nominal amounts, of course. What is important as well is so you have some caps in place for Annex 9B, 3.44% energy cap after double counting, and you have a 7% crop cap for food-based and feed and feedstock biofuels. That is an opt-out layer that member states can elect to get rid of to lower their overall obligation of 29% or 14.5% if you go for greenhouse gases. And in the gray zone, on the top of the bar, you have, of course, the possibility to, in that big gray zone, to use, of course, electricity with a nice fuse comparator of 183 grams of CO2 per megajoule. And you also have the possibility to use recycled carbon fuels in that layer, or more Annex 9A and RFNBOs. So quite a complex and parametric setup that member states will have to transpose in the next 18 months, and is coming with a number of alternatives on how those member states will approach that in terms of flexibility. I'll stop here because there are many uncertainties that we want to look for to look at in this transposition. RED for industry. So in terms of industry, we have the need for increasing the use of course renewable in industry. Industry was added to the scope of RED 3, and with a specific target for RFNBOs, which is to increase the uptake of RFNBOs by industry from 42% in 2030 to 60% in 2035, which will clearly call for imports actually into Europe. That was a clear perspective provided by our EU, and there is a mechanism in which you can lower this obligation by 20%. So it's 20% of 42%. It's not 22%. Okay, it's not as big as that. By meeting some criteria and having a low carbon grid for producing actually e-hydrogen in country, mainly targeting actually a country called France. I'll briefly touch base on the CO2 standards and CO2 emissions standards for, and let's start with light duty vehicles, that's to say cars and vans. I'm not going to spend much time on that. You've heard, of course, all about the ICE ban that was adopted in principle after the trilogues, and the sudden discussion and the need for reincorporating actually the use of CO2 neutral fuels into a delegated act. That was a last minute call. What is of course a concern for us is that we are talking about 0 grams of CO2 per kilometer in these standards from 2035, and there is no recognition for LCA emissions of low carbon fuels. We are only talking about the recognition in these standards of tailpipe emissions. And for heavy-duty vehicles, although it's not part of Fit-for-55, it's something that was that we wanted to give you a perspective on as well. So there is a new revision of the CO2, of the 2019 CO2 standard that is being under revision currently, and with an acceleration of the 2030 target, which goes from -30 to -45% in terms of CO2 emissions, and down to 90% in 2040, -90% of emissions. So it's not a ban, so to speak. In 2040, 10% remains to accommodate some vehicles that are out to decarbonize and have a long investment cycle. But in a caveat to that, in 2030 already, buses used for public transport in urban areas should be, new sales of those vehicles should go for zero carbon vehicles. So basically that's all we wanted to present to you as a recap for the different mechanisms. In terms of conclusion, what Jean-Pierre and I thought was of importance is that, of course, to remind that the package currently should deliver more than 55%. It is expected to deliver between 57 and 58%, presumably. But all the elements will tie into one another is going to be worth some attention and will deserve quite a lot of further impact assessment, because, of course, devil lies into the details, and not to be forgotten that in many of these regulations there would be a call for 2040 target clarification, and the discussions have started, so we are up for a fit for something for 2040. So it's a bit of a never-ending story. Okay. So this is all I wanted to present to you. Thank you.